Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Marge Humphrey, and I'm a Maryknoll lay missioner and a one-time member of the Catholic worker community in New York City. On behalf of the Maryknoll lay missioners, Maryknoll sisters, Maryknoll affiliates, and Maryknoll fathers and brothers, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to spend this very special day with us. We're privileged and honored to have a wonderful group of speakers and contributors with us, several of them very near and dear to Dorothy's own heart, as we all join in this day of learning and reflection. Dorothy Day has been called, as some of you may have heard, or many of you may have heard, the most significant, interesting, and influential person in the history of the American Catholic Church. And the Catholic worker has been described as the most important radical Catholic movement in American history. We're going to start today with a film, Don't Call Me a Saint. Don't Call Me a Saint, and then our speakers will follow. I'm going to introduce each speaker in more detail as they come up. But for now, we're happy to have join us Robert Ellsberg. Robert, please stand. Orbis Books. Patrick and Kathleen Jordan, longtime members of the Catholic worker. And Kate Hennessy, youngest grandchild of Dorothy Day. In addition, this afternoon, we will have two women from nearby Catholic worker communities who are active in Catholic worker communities today, who will speak about what's going on today. Next on our program is a speaker who is no stranger to most of us around Maryknoll or in many Catholic circles anyway in the country. We'll be speaking on what I have learned from Dorothy Day. Robert Ellsberg is the editor-in-chief of Orbis Books, the publishing arm of Maryknoll, where he's worked for the last 32 years. His path here began when he was 19 and joined the Catholic worker community in New York City. He was part of that community for the last 5 years of Dorothy's life and served for 2 years as managing editor of the Catholic worker newspaper. He has edited several volumes of writings by Dorothy Day, including Dorothy Day, Selected Writings, The Duty of Delight, The Diaries of Dorothy Day, and All the Way to Heaven, Selected Letters of Dorothy Day. In addition, he has written numerous books about saints, beginning with All Saints, Reflections on Saints, Prophets, and Witnesses for Our Time, and his most recent book, A Living Gospel, Reading God's Story in Holy Lives. So, without further ado, welcome.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to come to Maryknoll. Thank you for the introduction. And in the original draft of the flyer for this, it described me as a long-time idiot-in-chief of Orbis Books. I said that's a very common misspelling of idiot. It was fixed, but anyway, I think that in conjunction with the title that I don't remember if it was my idea or your idea, what I've learned from Dorothy Day, maybe it was Pat's idea, putting me on the spot. It sounded a little presumptuous because it implies that I have embodied and mastered all of these lessons. And it's a very broad topic, which I could probably talk about for the entire length of this symposium. I do have to point out that whatever lessons I've learned from Dorothy Day weren't just in the short years that I spent living and working with her. Lessons that began when I was 19, when I had everything in the world ahead of me to learn. But they continued after her death, when I set about to edit her selected writings and read everything that she had published and got to know her in a deeper way. It continued later, over 20 years after her death, when I and Pat and Kathleen and others were invited to join with Cardinal O'Connor to talk about the prospects for her canonization, a process that now we've been involved in for, another 20 years. It continued in a deeper way 25 years after her death, when I was invited by Marquette University to be the editor of her personal writings, her diaries and her letters. And I would say that all those years after first meeting her, it was as if I had met her for the first time, because I saw really inside of her heart and her soul, and you can experience that for yourselves and learn those lessons for yourselves by reading those volumes. I'm still learning. And I think that Dorothy, among other things, recognized that part of her function, part of her role was to pass along lessons, to share some of the things that she had learned and tried to live out. In one of her later columns in the Catholic Worker, she said, "What's it all about, the Catholic Worker movement? It is, in a way, a school, a work camp, to which large-hearted, socially conscious young people come to find their vocations. After some months or years, they know most definitely what they want to do with their lives. Some go into medicine, nursing, law, teaching, farming, writing, and publishing." I was 20 or whatever when she was writing this, and I still wonder how many people actually went into publishing, aside from myself, but it was prophetic, you see. And then she says, "They learn not only to love with compassion, but to overcome fear." So as far as finding my vocation, it wasn't like all at once. But as a writer, as a publisher, check. She set me in a way that I couldn't have imagined, when she asked me to be editor of the Catholic Worker when I was 20, on the path that was going to be my lifelong work and vocation. Strangely, not just as an editor, but as her editor. I don't think she sized me up in that way when she first saw me, but she, someday this young man will be my editor. But she did have an uncanny way, I think, of being able to recognize people's talents and abilities, their gifts, things that they weren't even aware of themselves, maybe things that didn't exist until she saw them and brought them into being, gave us responsibilities, beyond anything that I would have experienced, at college age at that time. As for learning to love, not only with compassion, but to overcome fear, well, that's for others to say. Those are lessons that they're never really finished. I guess I was looking to learn some things from Dorothy Day when I first went there. Maybe not exactly. Well, I learned, I think, quite a bit more than I was looking for. But I wanted to learn from someone who had spent her whole life trying to match her beliefs with the way she lived. I was attracted to the Catholic Worker by her witness and the history of the Catholic Workers' witness to nonviolence, and I wanted to see what that meant beyond just protesting wars, but as a kind of consistent way of living. I wanted to learn from someone who lived as if the Sermon on the Mount were true. I think those are the things that drew me there. Those are things you don't really learn from reading books. You learn from observing, seeing somebody who embodies those qualities, and I think that is a principle or a lesson that's right there in the gospel when disciples are tagging along after Jesus, former followers of John the Baptist. He says, "What are you looking for?" And they don't know what to say and say, "Where are you staying here? Where are you living?" or something. And he says, "Come and see." That kind of invitation to join along, to tag along after Jesus or after a disciple or a witness like Dorothy Day, to see how she lives, to see how she responds to things, to see the way that her beliefs, her creed is embodied in day-to-day action, not just on a heroic kind of scale, the kind of thing that gets in the newspapers, but just day-to-day in her interactions with people. So what did I see? What did I learn? What are the lessons I'm still trying to learn? I thought I'd share just a few of them with you today. Someone, I think it was John Court in the film, cited the line from Dostoevsky, from the Brothers Karamazov, that she liked to quote, the difference between love in dreams and love in action. Love in action, she said, we're quoting Dostoevsky, is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love in dreams. People can get kind of romantic about holy people, about saints, or sentimental. And she'd get very exasperated when people talk about her wonderful work with the poor. If you were down there, it wasn't always so wonderful. She knew the sights and the smells of destitution, the craziness, people with mental issues, people with anger issues, people with substance abuse issues. The life of what she called, quoting Dostoevsky, the insulted and the injured. There's a great, powerful passage in one of her essays, I think it was around the time of World War II, when people, charged that, well, you pacifists, you're very sentimental about life. And she said, let those who talk of softness and sentimentality come to live with us in cold, unheated houses in the slums. Let them come to live with the criminal, the unbalanced, the drunken, the degraded, the perverted. It's not decent poor. It's not the decent sinner who is the recipient of God's love. Let them live with rats, with vermin, bedbugs, roaches, lice. Let their flesh be mortified by cold, by dirt. Let their eyes be mortified by the sight of bodily excretions, diseased limbs, eyes, noses, mouths. Let their noses be mortified by the smells of sewage, decay, and rotten flesh. Let their ears be mortified by harsh and screaming voices. Then when they have lived with these comrades, with these sights and sounds, let our critics talk of sentimentality. Mm-hmm. And yet I also learned from Dorothy that life was not just hard among the poor. She had a capacity to see beneath the surface of things. On the surface, you might see noise, chaos, ugliness, squalor. But she always had an eye for the transcendent. I think he actually quoted me in the film there back in the time when I had a little more hair. With a light on a building, a trumpet vine on a balcony, the taste of a cup of coffee, which wasn't usually the highest quality coffee, a crust of bread, shared among people, an act of kindness, and the little oases of peace and beauty that she made room for in her life, whether listening to the opera or sitting in church or immersed in a novel. All those things were there if you knew where to look for them, and she had an eye for them. There's an essay where it's actually an essay about this pathetic young woman and her poverty of her life. But then she adds, walking across the park, I saw the sycamore trees, running golden green and the buds bursting, green veils, the bushes around the housing projects people can't afford to live in. Even the grass is brightening and starting up from the brown city soil. The earth is alive. The trees are alive again. Oh, the mysterious life and beauty of a tree. If you visited Dorothy's room, you saw that she had all on her walls, paintings, icons, but also picture postcards of nature, of icebergs or polar bears or mountains or rivers or anything like that. She loved Tivoli Farm, just sitting out there on the lawn, looking at the Hudson River and tankers and big ships going up the river. She loved sitting in Raritan Bay in Staten Island and just listening to the sound of the ocean, picking up driftwood, walking along the shore. Life was hard, but she always had that kind of, eye for the transcendent, eye for beauty. And as Kate used in the title of her book, that line again from Dostoevsky, that the world will be saved by beauty. She thought there wasn't enough beauty in the world, and not enough attention to beauty. And for all the hardness of life, her dominant, I think, mood was not one of anger or outrage, but of gratitude. Gratitude was a virtue that she celebrated, and she wanted it inscribed on her gravestone, Deo Gratias. That was the final word of her life. Gratitude for all that had been given to her. She said that when, the turning point in her life again, what was that? The birth of her daughter, experience of pregnancy, feeling that she had been given a gift so enormous that only God was big enough to receive it. And that was the foundation of her whole vocation, her lifetime. I learned from Dorothy about the importance of the will. Loving people who are not intrinsically lovable. It's work, it's a matter of will. It doesn't just come naturally. It's easy to love people who are lovable. You know, it's easy to feel delight when things are delightful. But putting love where there's no love, that's the essence of the gospel, which she tried to practice. And she believed that if you made enough effort, you could see in this difficult or disagreeable person next to you something of God's eternal light. If you tried hard enough, you could see it. And so if Dorothy could do that, it wasn't just because it just came naturally to her. It came because she worked at it. She tried harder. And I became aware from her, one of the things I learned was that you have to practice a certain kind of discipline to be able to do that. Again, not just making a conscious resolution every day, but a discipline for her that was practiced in prayer, in rising early in meditation over scripture, saying the rosary, in the sacraments, in saying evening prayers with the community. All those things were the context, the foundation that made it possible for her to do these things. That was something I didn't understand at all when I first came to the Catholic Worker. I think she's a Christian. Everybody knows Dorothy Days. She's a Christian. She's Catholic. Whatever that was supposed to mean. I wasn't a Catholic at the time. She read the Bible. She followed Jesus. But I didn't see the kind of work that requires, the kind of discipline, the kind of willpower to translate that into a living faith that's practiced every day. What attracted me to the Catholic Worker was that heroic history of civil disobedience and resistance. Dorothy being arrested during the civil defense drills in the 1950s. Dorothy supporting the young men who were burning their draft cards during the Vietnam War. Dorothy Day sitting there in California, surrounded with a burly police on either side, waiting to be arrested with the United Farm Workers when she was 75. That's the kind of, that's what I thought. I want to be part of that kind of community. I wasn't familiar with the reality that in the life of a very active person like that, very, many kind of heroic actions on the public stage, that most of her life, like the life of most of anybody, is spent in very quiet, undramatic ways. And that there's a relation between the two somehow. It's not like, oh, things are quiet, and then something exciting happens. No, it's because of that quietness, it's because of that dailiness that makes it possible when the moment arrives, when the moment in history speaks to us, to step up there. And I was not familiar, for instance, with the teachings of St. Therese of Lisieux when I came to the Catholic Worker, not being a Catholic, not being raised on stories of the saints, the little flower. I was very surprised when I discovered that of all the saints, St. Therese was Dorothy Day's favorite saint. And I thought, how could you have two people who could be less alike? Here's Dorothy Day, this activist, founder of a worker, of the Catholic Worker, a journalist. She's getting arrested. She's standing up before powers and princes and principalities. And here's the little flower who died when she was like 24 or something like that in a Carmelite convent in Normandy where she spent the last years of her young life. And it was very surprising to discover that St. Therese was Dorothy's favorite saint. Now, they had something in common. Dorothy was born the actual year that Therese died. But when she first read her book, she was very unimpressed. Someone, after her conversion, a priest gave it to her, and she said, well, this just shows priests think that women can't handle anything but this kind of pious pat. Here's this, she wanted a Joan of Arc or a Catherine of Siena, not this nun whose heroism consisted of putting up with all the idiots around her in the convent, spilling laundry water on her, and coughing and sneezing or saying the rosaries in an annoying way or something like that. What made the difference? I think it was her life in the Catholic Worker, experiencing hot and cold and disagreeable food and disagreeable people, all the things I described there, and discovering Therese's idea of the little way, which is the way of heroism, the way of sanctity that lies in all of our ordinary life, our encounters with other people, the chores we have to do, the people we meet, things we do, the little small things we do, all done in a spirit of love, charity. And that if you approach those little everyday kinds of things like that, ordinary life could become the fuel of sanctity, of heroism. You didn't have to be in the arena in the Roman Colosseum or something like that. You didn't have to be standing up in a firing squad. You didn't have to go to rest at civil defense drills like Dorothy Day. Everyday life could have these occasions to test our capacity for charity, forgiveness, understanding. I really came through to me very much when I was editing and reading her diaries. There you see that it's not just a chronicle of here's what I did today, here's who I saw today. It's where did I encounter God today, is what she's writing about, really. It doesn't say it exactly in those words. Where did I encounter God, or where did I fail to encounter God? Both those things. In the chores, in the frustrations, and the people imposing on her time, and the little irritations, and the little interruptions of daily life. And I'm not thinking that, my spiritual life is when I'm done with all of this business of Catholic worker daily life. It was right there in the middle of it. And realizing that Dorothy's practice of charity, forgiveness, patience in these little ways was the fuel of her drive to holiness. It was the practice that allowed her then to take the stage in these much more dramatic and heroic public ways. But even there, as an activist, or at least wannabe activist, a Catholic worker, very much interested in how to make a difference, how to end wars, how to be heard, how to be significant. I learned some very important kinds of lessons from Dorothy about what it means to act without a concern for results, to not be focused on outcomes or metrics or being heard or being important or being recognized or having your name in the paper. The importance of living out your faith, with purity of heart and purity of intentions, doing what is at hand, what's necessary to be done, and leaving the results in the hands of God. And Dorothy, I think that's one of the most remarkable gospel witnesses that she imparted to me, and I think to the world, is reminding us, and I think Pope Francis picks this up very much, where he talks all the time about the greatest danger for the church, spiritual worldliness. When we think according to the categories of the world, when we think that success or achievement or importance is the same as the kind of categories that everybody else in the world uses, and reminds us of Jesus's principle, which was that whatever he achieved was by means of apparent failure. That line, that unless the seed falls into the ground and dies, it bears no fruit. Dorothy was all, and I think Pope Francis is in that line too, all about planting seeds, all about the little way, all about the power that's hidden in what seems unimportant, what seems marginalized, what seems small. And that's, she was constantly correcting us, constantly reminding us not to stray in that idea that what's most important is what's going to get the most attention, what's going to get the biggest headline in the paper. She acted truly, I think, in a completely detached way from that kind of way of thinking. I learned from Dorothy that to be a radical is not just standing on a street corner and denouncing all the bad things in the world, all the things that they should be doing, all the things that the government is doing wrong, all the things that the government should be doing differently. It's about also modeling a different set of values of, as Peter Moore would say, kind of being the person you want the other person to be. That kind of personalist ethic. And of course she did protest against things, and of course she did walk on picket lines, and of course she did try to change things the way things were in the world. But she believed that we could start right now where we are, not wait for the perfect conditions to come along, not wait for all the money to be in the bank, not wait to get our manifesto finished. To start today. That was, the way that she started with Peter Moring. From the moment that he suggested to her the idea of the Catholic worker starting a newspaper, it was as if something snapped, as if a light went on. And a person who had been wandering around for years, searching for her vocation, was waiting for someone to just turn on that light bulb. And when she did, she just ran with it. How are we going to pay for it? She did ask that question. He said, the saints never worried about that kind of thing. They just started with what was in hand, what needed to be done, and they just did it. I learned from Dorothy Day that to live like that can be a tremendous adventure. When you were with Dorothy, you didn't feel like you were with a person who was filled with gloom or hopelessness. Dorothy was so realistic about the troubles of the world, the sufferings of people, how bad things were, even in her own community, how bad she was. She wrote about it all the time. I know how bad I am. I know how bad you all are. You don't have to point that out to me. But what you really felt, the dominant sense you had with Dorothy, was this great spirit of adventure, great spirit of joy, that this is fun, that what's going to happen next? It could be anything, these adventures in grace, that were part of Dorothy's life. John Court, who appears in the movie, died some years ago. He was one of the very first young men who came to work at the Catholic Worker right out of Harvard back in the 1930s. And he said he heard Dorothy give a talk somewhere. She was this really old woman. She was like, I don't know, 35 or something at the time. And he thought, she seems to be having a lot of fun. And he thought, I would like to be part of that. I would like to experience what that's like. And I think that was a quality that attracted many people to holy people, to saints. If they were depressing to be around, they tended to get a lot of followers. But someone like St. Francis, here on the one hand, he'd been a successful young man, prosperous family, happy-go-lucky, and now he's living, in rags down with the lepers and the poor and all this kind of thing. And yet people were so turned on by him. Young men were, especially, and then women too in the town, found there was something alive about him, something attractive. He seemed to have like a kind of secret of life, an effervescence, a kind of joy, and they wanted to be part of that. That too was a matter of will. I named her diaries The Duty of Delight. I saw that line originally. It's the last line of The Long Loneliness. She doesn't attribute it there. She just says it's difficult to remember the duty of delight. I found in reading her diaries that was a line that she found in a letter by the English critic John Ruskin, and it somehow stuck with her. It became almost a kind of mantra. And I don't think she really wrote essays about it or anything, but it's just there in her diaries. There's something she said to herself, the duty of delight. Again, it's easy to be delighted when things are delightful. But that conscious choice, I think, what did the duty of delight mean? She'd often repeat it after a recitation of all the terrible things that were going on in the house and how depressing everything was, and then she would say, duty of delight. Toward the end of her life, she'd say, where did I get that line again? She still remembered the line, she didn't know where it came from, but she knew what it meant. It meant finding God in all things. Not just the things that are beautiful, not just the things that cheer us up or whatever, but that there was, in the eyes of faith, you could find access to God in everything. And it was your duty, it was your discipline, it was your will that made it possible for you to do that, not just because you were naturally attuned to that. As Marge mentioned, I've spent quite a lot of my life now writing about saints and holy people, 6 books, I think. And the latest one also has a chapter about Dorothy and some of the other people I've especially learned from. And I think that's also, one of the things I learned or I picked up from Dorothy along the way. This sense of holy people as saints, not just as these legendary figures from the past that we see in a statue or a stained glass window, but friends and companions, human beings like ourselves who can be guides and perfecters of our faith. This title of the film we just saw, Don't Call Me a Saint, often I think taken from the larger line. Don't call me a saint. I don't want to be dismissed that easily. I bear a little responsibility for the fame of that line, which I used in the introduction to her selected writings. I honestly don't know where I got it from, and yet it has become maybe the most famous line that Dorothy ever said. I was teaching a course in Brooklyn, students who didn't know who the president was during World War II, but they, literally. You were talking about the president during World War II. I don't remember who that was, but you said, anyway, when I asked them, if I said, do you know who Thoreau is, or Camus, or whatever, do you know who Dorothy Day is? Isn't she the person who said, don't call me a saint? If that's the one thing she would be remembered for, So, I regret because it sounds a little cynical and flip. It makes it sound like for Dorothy, she didn't really believe in venerating saints. Nothing could be further from the truth. Pat, in the film, talked about her picketing St. Joseph there for coal or beans, for the soup. She had tremendous veneration for saints, and she talked about them as if they were, Sacco and Vanzetti or Gandhi or any other kind of person that you could learn from, or that their stories were important, or they had something to do with us. If you read the Catholic Worker, especially back in the old days, Adi Bethune, Fritz Eichenberg, the great artists, the paper was almost entirely illustrated by pictures of saints who were maybe wearing ordinary modern clothes, setting about performing the works of mercy or caring for the sick or walking on a picket line or whatever it was, doing their daily life. And she would constantly refer to St. Francis and St. Benedict and St. Teresa of Avila, St. Teresa of Lisieux. Dorothy she didn't want, while she was alive, she didn't want to be put on a pedestal. She wouldn't want us now to put her on a pedestal, saint or not saint. And in that sense, she's no different from any other saint. I mean, a saint says, call me a saint. I love it when you call me a saint. You never find any saint in history who said that. But they all, like Dorothy, wanted to be saints. And by that, they didn't mean to be canonized. They didn't mean to have churches named after people praying for them in front of their statues. They meant by that to be the person God had created them to be an image of Christ in the world, to put off the old person, to put on Christ. It was a process. That's a lifetime process. It's not done at a certain time. And that's one of the things I think I learned from Dorothy too, that holiness is not a matter of, you read the lives of the saints. Well, when did they become a saint? Well, they're canonized, maybe centuries after their death or whatever, but that doesn't change who they were. When was the point when they became a saint? Was it when St. Paul was knocked off his horse? Was it when St. Francis kissed a leper? Was it when St. Benedict founded his community at Monte Cassino? Was it when St. Augustine became a Catholic? I think that what you see actually is a journey of people who walk the path of holiness. And when we look at it in those terms, we have more of a sense of the continuity that we share with them, rather than this great chasm that separates them and puts them in a whole different category. There are those who walk ahead of us, who walk before us, as I feel that Dorothy does for the church as a whole. As much as we listen to her messages and learn her lessons and follow in her way, she's somehow still always out there ahead, walking forward, calling us, what are you looking for? Come and see, I think of, we think what would be great if Jesus gave us a handbook on how to be a saint. Well, start with the Beatitudes, Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the merciful, blessed are those who mourn. It's interesting that Jesus didn't say, blessed are these kind of qualities. Blessed are the people who embody these qualities. And from them, we can learn something about what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus, to be a disciple. Now, he didn't give specific examples because we didn't have a Roman martyrology at that point. It was all up there ahead of us. But Dorothy, I think of her as someone not only as a woman of the Beatitudes, that is to say, wow, when you think about it, you go check off that whole list and you think, who better embodies those principles? The poor in spirit, the merciful, the meek, the peacemakers, those who hunger for righteousness. But not only that, but she enlarges our understanding of what those things even mean. When we look at Dorothy, we have a different understanding of what it means to be poor in spirit. Not just her voluntary poverty, but the whole option for the poor. That kind of, a church that is poor and for the poor, as Pope Francis puts it. You think of, those who mourn. It's not just being sad all the time. We all have reason to be sad. But that quality that Dorothy had of never getting used to injustice, never getting used to suffering and saying, well, that's just the way it is, never hardening her heart, And when she did, when she just drew limits, she felt remorse about that. She felt that she had denied being Christ for other people and seeing Christ in them when she drew those limits. Pope Francis, when he went to Lampedusa, the island where so many refugees have drowned in the Mediterranean, and he says, who weeps for these people? Who weeps for these people? The whole Mediterranean has become a vast cemetery. And I think, well, Pope Francis weeps for them, but Dorothy wept for them, the merciful, okay? You think of blessed are the merciful, someone who does a good deed or performs a work of mercy. But what about somebody who makes a whole lifestyle of mercy, who builds a whole community, who builds a whole movement around mercy, who points in the direction of what the Pope has talked about, of a church of mercy? You can go through each one of these things. I'll just skip ahead and reflect on, blessed are the peacemakers. Dorothy's not just a peacemaker. She redefined what that means for the whole church. Because of Dorothy Day, we have a sense that being a peacemaker is not just being a person who doesn't fight in a war, but someone who devotes her whole life to opposing violence and hatred and disunity in every form and is willing to pay a price for it. Dorothy did more than anybody in the 20th century among Catholics to remind us of the peacemaking ethic of Jesus. Now, if I learn anything from Dorothy about saints, I also learned from her that saints are human beings. They're not perfect people. Dorothy, we know about her faults because she writes about them. Her self-righteousness, her anger, her impatience. And she reminds us again that being a saint is a day-by-day, one step after the time project. It's falling down and getting back up again. It's, Lord, I believe, help me in my unbelief. That kind of lifetime of commitment and dedication that Dorothy followed is something that is a lesson that we need to keep on learning. And I mentioned that I've learned from Dorothy at different times in my life. I would say, as I get older now, not that old, but she always retained that spirit of adventure, that instinct for the heroic, which is something that she always attributed to youth. And I think it gave her this youthful quality, and it's one of the reasons young people were so attracted to her. When you were with Dorothy, you were conscious that this is someone a lot older than you, certainly at that age. But she was also like a peer somehow. She wasn't like someone from a distant generation. She understood the sufferings and the searchings of youth. She remembered her own youth. She remembered her own first love, and I don't mean just in Forster. I mean the way Pope Francis says that we have to remember our first love and go back to that time in our life when the Spirit just was fresh, when we were hearing the gospel for the first time, when it seemed like an enormous adventure to follow Jesus. And she retained that to the end. She was willing to make sacrifices. She was willing to be put out on the street for refusing to pay taxes in the 1970s. She stared down the IRS. Pat Jordan was around. Kathleen were around for that. She was there when she was arrested with the farm workers, much decades younger than her, these young farm workers out there in California. She always had this sense. She was starting a new house of hospitality for women, in the 70s, just in the very last years of her life. Mary House, where she ended up dying. She always had that sense that we never retire. When Pope Francis talks about that too, the saddest thing is young people who've retired before their age or before their time. Same is true maybe for old people too, or older people. to not retire, to continue to have that freshness, that sense of energy, that sense of desire, that sense of hope that drives us forward. In her diaries, I found this passage. No matter how old I get, no matter how feeble, short of breath, incapable of walking more than a few blocks, what with heart murmurs, heart failure, emphysema perhaps, arthritis in feet and knees, with all these symptoms of age and decrepitude, my heart can still leap for joy as I read and suddenly assent to some great truth enunciated by some great mind and heart. Dorothy was a believer in the line she loved, the sacrament of the present moment. She believed that God was waiting to encounter us in every chore of daily life, in every person we met. In each situation, in each encounter, in each task before us, there was a path to God. We didn't have to be in a monastery or a chapel. We didn't have to become different people first. We could start today, this moment, where we are, to add to the balance of love, the balance of peace. I could go on all day, but those are just a few of the things I learned from Dorothy Day, and I'm still trying to learn. Thank you very much.
We have just a few minutes if anybody has questions for Robert. We'll have a couple of people with mics if I can figure out.
Are there any lessons that you didn't complete?
Anybody have a question?
Thank you very much. Sorry?
On the bottom. On the bottom.
I can show.
This is where you got it.
Okay, we've got a working one.
I didn't do it.
Yes, you did.
John, I know it's you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for the most interesting.
Put it right up against your mouth.
Yeah, it's not considered against like you drink less beer, somebody said. There seemed to be a conflict or a contrast of some kind. I probably missed a link in there. But between the notion, Dorothy's notions of don't worry about, you don't have to worry about the results, just do it, that kind of an approach, and also becoming known, making the cause known. Not particularly becoming famous, but pointing to the reality and looking for people's reaction to that.
I think, well, there's a difference, let's say, between, bearing witness and then the results of that. Whether people hear it, whether people do anything about it, whether they take notice, that's out of your control. But absolutely, your job is to just live what you believe, but to give reasons for the faith within you, as St. Paul says. And she, said there, someone said, accept any invitation that you give, go wherever you go. And she did that traveling all over the country, crisscrossing on buses back in the old days, to accept any invitation. And also to visit the other communities, to exhort them, to encourage them, to listen, to write about what she learned. So obviously in a newspaper, you're concerned about publishing something, you're trying to make something known, ideas, and she thought the most important thing about ideas is the way that they're lived out. And so she wrote about what she was doing firsthand, what she knew, and what other people were doing. That's mostly what was in the Catholic Worker, rather than theoretical kinds of things. But within a couple of years, the circulation of the Catholic Worker was 100,000. It was amazing how it just took off like wildfire. And then comes the Spanish Civil War, and then comes World War II, and she takes this pacifist position. And the circulation plummets. And so she didn't think, well, maybe we should change our editorial line. We're losing a lot of subscribers, you know. It was the same, you know, the message was the message. And she didn't tailor it or trim it according to the fashion of the day.
Yeah, thank you.
Aren't you Jewish? Are you Jewish? I thought I heard a story about you being Jewish and how you came to come to Orbis Books. I know that's...
That would have been a good story. It's not as good as that. I mean, my family heritage, at least on my father's side, is Jewish, but I was raised in the Episcopal Church, and you know, took that kind of seriously when I was a kid, but had kind of drifted away by the time I made my way to the Catholic Worker. I wasn't attracted. I went to the Catholic Worker in spite of its being Catholic, and it seemed, well, it's kind of close to being an Episcopalian, you know, whatever. Familiar with it, with the liturgy and whatever, but it was really only in the course of my time there, 5 years at the Catholic Worker, that I ultimately decided I wanted to become a Catholic. And it might seem like an inevitable thing, like, well, of course you were on Dorothy Day, of course you became a Catholic, but it took a while for me to realize that the church was something bigger than the Catholic Worker, bigger than Dorothy Day. She would have been the first one to say that, but it took me a while to understand that. So when I did, I wanted to be part of that. So that is also part of the journey that you know that happened there and led me on the journey that led me here. Yeah.
I just want to say I'm Maryknoll's sister, and my first mission was New York City. And nobody who's Maryknoll's sister wanted to go to New York City, especially when you're from Brooklyn. And I think that Dorothy found that very curious. But one of the blessings was that Dorothy came to visit us often. She must have known there was a Maryknoll community around, and she would come and spend an evening with us. And she was really enchanted by the stories of, we had several sisters who had left China. And so when she'd hear those stories, she would come back again and come back again. But another thing, I remember she knew what questions to ask. We were just kids, you know, brand new, and one of the diocesan priests started this program called Summer in the City. Now we're all out on many of you know it, and we're all out on the street, and we're going to really change this neighborhood. You know? And Dorothy Day's walking around and watching this whole thing, and one day she stopped me, and I was busy. I was really busy cleaning the rust off somebody's mailbox. I don't know, he's 5th Street or he's 6th, I don't know. But I was going to make that shiny. And she said to me, so what are you doing? Oh, I said, we're going to fix up this block. And she said, where's the landlord? I thought she knew what question to ask. Where is the landlord? So I dropped my cloth, and that was it.
Never look back. The mailbox is now shining.
Clean.